Hello there and welcome to BoBeats, and I'm just back from Ether Festival. Synth Festival, it was a ton of fun. I haven't even unpacked, but I wanted to get this video out for you. I did a live presentation with the Minilogue XD going over basic synthesis, some sound design philosophy. This is a long one, so I've put some timestamps in the description. I'm going over oscillators, LFO, envelopes, and I try to give some good explanations of what an oscillator is, what it can do, different techniques you can use to shape the sound, to create modulations, and I try my best to give a good beginner-friendly introduction to synthesis, but also give kind of a pretentious little talk on my sound design philosophy and how I created my patches for the circuit, the Minilogue, the peak, and so on, the patches that you can find linked down below at my store. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you do, hit the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more stuff about synths and music production. Now, let's head to Ether Festival in Lund, Sweden. To my colleagues, I work, right now I work full-time with YouTube, but previously I worked at a university, and when my colleagues were asking me, what is it you're doing? I just said that, I do instructional videos about music equipment. And they were like, okay, what kind of equipment? Yeah, synths, okay, yeah. They're like, Casio? No, not Casio, not Casio. I hear you're laughing, I feel I'm in my element now, I feel much better about this already. My name is Bo, and I make videos about synths, upload them to the internet, and I have a ton of geeks who tell me I'm wrong about technical things. So I will probably offend somebody here tonight as well. So I've been making a bunch of presets the last few years, for example, for the Innovation Circuit. Do you have any Innovation Circuit users in the house? One. Okay, that's good. Have you bought my pack?
No.
No, okay. Well, after today you can go and decide if you will. Synthesis is so cool because you can go from something like this just figuring out where your threshold is, like how much you can take. Yeah, so you can go from something like this to something like this. Something more mellow than the sawtooth, I think it was, that we heard previously. So we're still just using one synthesizer. So if you're unaware, this has a sequencer, some programmed stuff on it, but it's still just one synth. It's no backing tracks or anything. So this is what you can do as well. You can switch it up a bit. And I think that's that's what's so cool about synths, is that you can take something as raw and brutal as a initialized sound, just a waveform, and turn it into something beautiful, something magic, something interesting. So we can go from something like this to something that's actually interesting to listen to. So my approach to sound design is very much thinking of sound design as a sculpting process, or seeing a synth as a blank canvas that we can fill with colors. Now, if we're only using the raw waveforms, we are just utilizing primary colors. So I tend to think about it a lot as taking something very sterile and sculpting it into something beautiful and emotional, making something come to life, if you will. So it's about shades and nuances, and I hope we can explore some of that today. For anybody who is new to synths, a synth creates a sound using what we call an oscillator. So this is an oscillator, this is an oscillator, this is an oscillator. There are different waveforms. So a sawtooth, a triangle, and a more square wave type sound. And an approach I have is also to think about them as different modes, so different emotional states. So, for example, a sawtooth is a little bit more aggressive. The triangle, especially on the XD here, is almost like a sine wave. It's very mellow. And then we have the square wave, the beautiful square wave. Very digital sounding, very, digital, hard edges, metallic. One of the most basic ways of creating a synth sound from scratch is by combining different oscillators. Anybody who's touched a synth before knows this. So we have a mixer section on this synth. Mixer is basically like what we have over here. So it's a mixer that combines different signals. So for example, we have one square wave, and we can add a second square wave if we want to. Now, this is an analog synth, so to my understanding, if this were a digital synth, it might not sound exactly the same. I think these oscillators, they drift a little bit, so you can hear there's a drift to it. And just a kind of a basic technique you can do is just detuning the oscillators just a little bit. So we have a pitch control that controls the pitch of the oscillator. And we can just detune it, say 10%, let's do a sawtooth. We can detune one, down 10%, one up. You can hear when it starts going out of tune. So we can add some, I promised myself I'd add some reverb for your listening pleasures, so it sounds a little better. So now we suddenly go from something super boring, something a little fuller. The next thing I want to touch on in trying to understand a synth is that we can not only work with the primary colors, we can not only work with the raw waveforms, we can also sculpt them. So most synths has a way to shape the sound, shape the waveform. So this synth in particular has two knobs here called shape. And if we just take one of the oscillators, so we have a square wave, we can shape it. So we're manipulating, we're changing the waveform. And we can of course do it differently to two different oscillators. So that's another way to create attention, evoke some emotions by changing the shape. So this is what I call like creating nuances or working the clay, if you will, if I'm using the sculpting metaphor. And when we are using the shape, we can of course do very standard things. Some of you are probably well aware about this. We can, for example, do pulse width modulation, which is a popular technique. So if we have one, I'm just using one oscillator. You can hear that there's a movement going on in the sound, which is an LFO, we'll get to that in a little while, controlling the shape of one oscillator. And we can, of course, do this with two different oscillators set at different shape values. We could pitch one down, also an octave. Sounds a bit better, I think, already. Now, what we can do, of course, is we can also work with the pitch. We could, for example, take the second oscillator, pitch it up about 7 semitones. Another way to make more of a full sound, something more interesting. So working with just pitch, a bit of different shapes here, and some modulations of the shape, we have gone from something quite boring to something more interesting. Some of you might be well aware that we have something called an amp EG, or amp envelope generator. And this is a section that I think is interesting because it's a way to say, okay, what kind of form do I want for my sound? Do I want something something with a long attack? Or do I want something short and plucky? So when we look at a synth, it's good to envision it a lot like what is moving the knobs for me. So you saw me changing the shape here, but also set up an LFO to move the knobs for me. When I'm setting up this envelope here to create a plucky sound, you can envision it a bit like having somebody magically move, an invisible hand moving the fader of the sound, the mixer volume up and down. So for something like this. So if it's a long attack, and if it's short and plucky, it's more. So the amp EG consists of, for example, an attack, setting how quickly something appears. Decay, sustain, and release. This is, of course, different for different synths. And with this, we can set a lot of the expression of the sound. One of the biggest things with a synth is, of course, that we have a filter. There are different types of filter: low pass, high pass, band pass, and so on. On this synth in particular, it's a fixed filter, so it's a low pass, which means that if we turn the knob from its max or default position and turn on the resonance, you can hear how the filter cuts away the higher frequencies. And I think when I approach making a sound, the filter becomes very important because it's where I set the attention. Where do I want the attention to be? Do I want it to be a bright sound? Something bright, something that makes people react, or I want it to be more subtle? So the cutoff changes the sound pretty radically, removes the higher frequencies in this case, or cuts them off. The resonance, on the other hand, is a point determined by the cutoff knob here, where the sound is amplified to a certain extent, depending on how much resonance. That the sound gets an amplification depending on where I set the cutoff. And this is also a way to sort of create interesting tensions and movements to the sound. It's a lot about like adding emphasis. On some synths, the resonance is also called emphasis, just because it sort of emphasizes a certain point along the frequency spectrum. So there I was sort of emphasizing more the tail, the wobbling tail of the sound a little bit more, using the resonance. On this synth in particular, we have the envelope generator here, so it's another envelope. On most synths, the signal is predetermined. You can do small changes to it, it's not entirely modular, and this envelope here is just an attack and a decay, so it functions basically like the EG that we saw earlier, but it's more limited. And this EG here can be set up to affect pitch, for example. Can be set up to affect the pitch of the second oscillator. This is also known as annoying your neighbors. 3 o'clock in the night. Oh, we're gonna get to some more annoying shit later that you can do, just some techniques. Then we can also set it up to cutoff. So basically controlling the filter using an envelope. But basically, it's easy just to think about it, that it's attack value. Attacks has to do with how fast something comes in. And then we have some way of sustaining it, some way of lengthening it. And here it's attack and decay. We also have intensity, and it's set up basically how much of something is changing. So for example, if we set it to the cutoff here, for example, negative goes up and here it goes down. Starts higher, goes down. Starts lower, goes up. And we can of course use this to create all manner of interesting sounds. So one very commonly used technique that people do is that they use it to create what is called a sync sound. So it's one of the most annoying and overused sounds in the history of sounds, apart from the 808. Don't hate me, but basically what we have here is the fact that we are syncing the oscillators together. That's another feature of a synthesizer. Basically that we are syncing the pitch of the two oscillators. So when we are sending or using this envelope here, we're basically telling the pitch of oscillator number 2 to change, to move. But when we're syncing the oscillators, the synth gets upset and it says, back to your place, back to your place. This is why we get this kind of weird wow sound. We can also do more subtle things, which I think is more interesting, because as I said earlier, for me, my philosophy is a lot that when you want to design sounds, it's often more about the subtle things. So we can still use the envelope here to control the pitch of the second oscillator. So this is obviously way too much. Like, it could be useful, but it's a bit too much. But what if we just do it a smidge? Find that point where the pitch it's like close enough to work if we had a bass line. but it's not over the top. It's not something extreme. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea. So we're still just using very minor things here in order to shape our sounds. We don't have to go overboard. Next up on a synth, we have something called an LFO. So it's a low frequency oscillator. We talked about oscillators earlier. The very quick explanation is that an oscillator, it's moving so fast that it's audible, and a low frequency oscillator is an oscillator moving so slowly that we can't hear it, which makes it really good for controlling something else. So on this synth in particular, we're using an LFO to, for example, control pitch. And here's a good tip if you want to annoy your neighbors. So this is what I do in the evenings. And of course, even with more extreme things, we can do musically interesting things. We can, of course, create rhythms. If you imagine a sequence running, and at the end of the sequence, we just kind of increase the rate of this oscillator a bit, or the LFO a bit. Very interesting things with it. What is an LFO? How can we envision it if somebody's new to this and have a hard time understanding what it is? Yet again, we can use the metaphor of the moving hand. So imagine it being a hand that moves something for you in a particular way. So, for example, if we put it to shape, for example, basically moves the shape knob that I talked about earlier here for us. So that's one way to think about it. It's moving something for us. And of course, we have different types of LFOs as well. We talked about oscillators having different waveforms, and LFO, of course, have different waveforms as well. So we can, for example, have a square wave instead. So I think a good way to think about it is always the magic hand that moves something, invisible hand. We went over pretty much the basics of a subtractive synth by now. We've talked about the oscillator section, generating the sound. We talked about shaping it, turning it into something more interesting, appealing. We talked about mixing different signals together, the filter, removing things in this particular case because it's a subtractive synth. So it's removing and emphasizing certain parts of the frequency spectrum. And we also have the envelope generators of different kinds that operate more based on time than anything, and the LFO is more movement. You can take, for example, you can take an envelope generator and create an LFO from it by looping it. You can also use an LFO basically like an envelope, because there are one-shot modes as well. So, for example, in this particular case, you can hear that it's creating a change. It's doing something, but it's not repeating because it's a one-shot. It just does it one time. One other thing I wanted to kind of show you, that is something that I found super intriguing, and I was thinking like how to explain this in a way that doesn't sound too convoluted. This is cross modulation or frequency modulation. So we have the beautiful sound here, and we talked about having different tools to make small or large, but mostly small subtle changes, varying this boring sound. We can use the shape to vary it. But we can also do frequency modulation. It's mostly known from the classics like DX7, FM synths, so in the digital realm, but we can do it on an analog synth as well. It's slightly different because the analog oscillators, to my understanding anyway, because the analog oscillators are they are not as stable as a digital oscillator. So when you use a digital oscillator, the frequency modulation will be quite different. You can't exactly mimic DX7 sound with this kind of synth. Instead of having an LFO, so we can have an LFO here, as I showed you earlier, we can modulate the shape of a sound. Instead of having an LFO do it, an LFO is pretty slow, so we can increase the rate and you'll start to hear how the LFO creates tonality. Here additional notes. But instead of doing this, we can use frequency modulation, taking, in this case on this particular synth, the oscillator number 1 and using it to modulate oscillator number 2. So we can remove the sound from with the mixer here and only listen to oscillator 2. And if I increase the cross mod here, the frequency modulation, I'm modulating. It sounds similar to what I was doing here with LFO, but it's faster because the oscillators are moving much quicker. And this is also a way to create more interesting sounds if we don't go overboard. So for example, let me see if I can just make something that sounds a little bit decent. So for example, here we have this very boring sound. No good. No bueno. But if we put it like here, maybe. So there we have a bit of movement. And that small change will have an impact on how we perceive and feel the sound emotionally. And then we of course can stack it with other things. So we could use, for example, the rate and the intensity here of the LFO. Those who are paying very close attention will note that I'm only playing the same 3 chords. And it's those that I know. Basically, because the oscillator moves so fast, the result is audible. Instead of LFO here, it's not audible. And it can be perceived as a change of the harmonics of the second oscillator, or even, as we heard, a change of pitch, because we can increase it so much. We have to break up the sound. And then, of course, having gone over all the basics of subtractive synthesis, we of course can just do some effects here, because if nothing else works, you can just add the most crazy effects that you can find. So the way I approach sound design is that there are fundamentally 2 different approaches to it. This ties into my background as a psychotherapist. You can go top-down, so this means top-down processing. It means that you have a clear idea of what it is you want to create. I'm going to do an 808, I'm going to do a sync lead sound, whatever. We can go from there. But you can also do what I call the bottom-up. It's that you let the experience of sound guide you, and this is very much my philosophy when I approach and create patches for it. So top-down refers to using concepts and understandings that you have already, so preconceived notions. And lets you interpret the world around you. So your mind is filled with all of this. So for example, a lead sound needs to be snappy and maybe it should be unison and have a bit of chorus or something like that. Whereas bottom up refers more to letting the experience of the sound itself guide you. It's more like you're sitting with a piece of clay and you're letting that guide you, the clay itself, rather than the idea of creating something specific. And I think that this idea of when you're approaching sound design, and if you're a beginner or if you're an intermediary or even if you're a professional, this idea of putting a parenthesis on your understanding of what a sound should be is very interesting. Trying to be a little bit more mindful here and now, and focusing more on like, what is the sound trying to tell you? Listening. This is why I highlighted the importance of listening to the small changes. So for example, when I create sounds, I very much prefer not to have a clear goal. For example, let me bring up just something. I mean, we listen to my crappy sounds that I just made up on the fly, but let me play something that with a little bit more intent. Is that I'm always trying to find ways that lead me beyond the standard. And sometimes it might sound good, like garbage too. Or something like this, which I think sounds pretty cool. That was my presentation for you. So thank you so much for coming. I'll be hanging out outside, creating a physical comment section where you can tell me everything I got wrong about technical stuff. If you want to check me out on YouTube, it's youtube.com/BoBeatsMusic. Also jokingly referred to as BoBeats, but you don't wanna go YouTube searching for BoBeats because that's actually a thing, and it's a little bit disgusting. I hope he's not here today, but when I started out with YouTube, I said, you know, at least when somebody searches for BoBeats, I want to get top, you know, I want to, and now I am. I won the internet. So I'm actually, I'm probably going to eat something at some point in some video just because people asked me to. I tried to cook a molka one time, but yeah, it wasn't so-so. But thank you so much. I'm going to stick around a little bit if people want to ask questions, but now we're going to tear stuff down for the next workshop. So thank you so much for being patient with me. If you made it this far, thank you so much. Let me know in the comments section what you thought about the presentation. Let me know that you made it this far so I can give you a little hearts icon for sticking with me for 30 plus minutes. Thank you so much. Hope to see you in another video. Talk to you later.